Wipeout, when we first look back, would be a cornerstone of the huge success seen on the Sony PlayStation, but it would also influence the landscape of where video games would go from that point on, as it had massive influences over the racing, but even the real life culture with the likes of nightclubs, the clubbing scene, even the music that was being generated around that time. It just had a massive influence on the youth of that generation during the early to mid 90s, and it would be of no surprise, while it did take a while, for more versions to appear on other systems, one of them being the Sega Saturn. Mind you, we would have to wait a little while before the port would be handled over to that console, which would give an opportunity for a production company known as Perfect Entertainment to take on the role of porting the game to the Sega Saturn during 1996. While the game was extremely popular on Sony's console, would it have had the same effect on the Sega Saturn? Well, the one thing that's apparent with the game is, regardless of which platform that you have managed to play the game on, the influences were apparent. It had virtually the same soundtrack, give or take maybe a few subtle changes, but there were some major differences with regards to the likes of even the visuals and the overall control systems of the game. When we look into the details of the game, there are a variety of different modes with time trials and even like different classes. Now they will differ in difficulty depending on which ones you begin with. You will unlock further ones as you progress through the various championships and modes. There's 6 main tracks in total, but there is a hidden one that you'll only unlock once you've completed pretty much everything in the game, but you can unlock it with cheats if you want to go that route instead. But they all differ in terms of their overall themes and backgrounds, and there is some great level of detail. While yes, not as refined as that seen on Sony's console, but they do a damn good job of looking highly presentable on the Saturn. And if you've played the PlayStation version and you want to play the Saturn version, well, you'll feel right at home here because there is a lot of similarities, as the track layouts are pretty much identical in many respects.
Missile.
In many cases, the Sega Saturn version was often considered as slightly inferior to that of the PlayStation, as yes, most of us all know that the PlayStation was more capable to focus on 3D specifics within video games, whereas the Saturn focused on more 2D aesthetics, but it could still handle 3D elements very, very well. And it's not to say that the Wipeout port is bad on the Saturn. If anything, it's still one of its best racers on the system. The graphics are really good, even though they are slightly less detailed than what you would have seen on the PlayStation. The overall sense of speed also feels a little bit slower. Even the handling physics at times can feel a little bit sluggish, but you have to remember that even the PlayStation version of this game was extremely tough. It's still a tough game even to play today. It is one of those elements that it just takes time to master and get used to the finesse of the control system. One of the major things that even I found when you look at the Saturn and even the PlayStation version, and this goes down to the handling physics and the collision detection more predominantly. If travelling at speeds in the PlayStation version, if you tipped off the side of the barrier, yes, it would slow the racer or the aircraft down, but if you hit it too hard, it would come to a stop and almost do like a barrel roll on the spot, which would lead, if you didn't have a good distance ahead of your competitors, they will catch up with you. But I found that by playing the Saturn version, while I found it a little bit more tricky and fiddly to control, when you did whack into a barrier, you didn't have that same effect as such with completely slowing down. If anything, there are definitely some differences or some refinements with regards to the collision detection when it came to the Saturn port. If anything, they made it better, as it didn't completely slow down the aircraft, so you could continue on with the race without too much distractions. Now, in saying that, when you played the game on harder difficulties, yeah, it would be more apparent, but at least for making mistakes, you weren't crucified as much as you would have been, say, on the PlayStation version. Now, from reviews of the time, it stated that the Saturn version was much more responsive with the controls compared to the PlayStation. And, well, yeah, I suppose in some ways it is. I found it to be a bit more twitchy and a bit more fiddly on the Saturn, but then I suppose that was due to the responsiveness, because when you did try to move in a direction, it would go nearly instantly, as it was a lot more sensitive, I will admit, to that of the PlayStation. So I suppose those refinements did help in some ways. It took a bit longer to get used to, especially if you compare the two versions side by side. But make no mistake, regardless of whichever versions of the game that you played, it was a defining moment in video games, with its pulse-pounding electronic beats, which helped to change the world of racing games forever. And the developers did do a good job with porting the game to the system, as they would soon follow with its sequel, Wipeout 2097, not too long after, with that game being arguably what I would consider to be the best Wipeout game in the entire series on the PlayStation. And the same can be said for the Sega Saturn, but there are also differences with the Saturn version as well, very like the first game here, especially with the graphics and even the overall sense of speed, but it's still a solid game overall. But it's interesting because when we look back in the early 90s, and especially with the studio Psygnosis at the time, they had their sights set on the future of 3D gaming, and along with the help of the Designers Republic, which did all of the artwork for the game, while also being inspired by the emerging rave culture of the time, Wipeout would become one of the most cutting edge video games ever seen. While it did greatly help the PlayStation, in many ways it did also help the Saturn, as the vision of the game was more stylish, more mature, more technologically advanced, and it's easy to see why Sega wanted a piece of that action for their own console. Originally though, after Wipeout was released on the PlayStation, Psygnosis, because they had closer ties to Sony, initially didn't have any real plans to bring Wipeout to the Sega Saturn. However, Sega were eager to compete, and they wanted to have a version of the game on their own system for themselves. While there are some drawbacks when you look at the differences between the two games, and some of the elements are immediately noticeable, especially with the sharp textures and smooth frame rates would have been on the PlayStation, it was slightly dumbed down to run efficiently on the Saturn's hardware. So obviously compromises had to be made, as there was certain limitations on that system, as it couldn't handle the high frame rates or the texture resolutions, even the reduced draw distances and transparency effects. So there would have to be tweaks made to some of the colour palettes and designs to suit the aesthetic of the game, to at least make it somewhat relevant to what was seen on the PlayStation. I think one of the major differences as well is that the PlayStation manages to maintain a steady frame rate, while the Saturn had to dip slightly lower to get it to run more efficiently. And while that might be a big issue for a lot of gamers out there that like authenticity, for those of us that are casual and couldn't care less about any of that stuff, it didn't really make too much of a difference. The only way you'd really know is if you played the two side by side. But we do have to remember that back then, not everybody had a PlayStation, not everybody had a Sega Saturn, and there was always alliances with certain brands. You either Sega or you were Nintendo or you were, at the time, PlayStation. It just whichever was more suitable to you, or whichever you could afford, or whichever you were more familiar with. That's really what the case was. But I still think, on a personal note, it was very, very cool to see a lot of these PlayStation games actually be ported to the Sega Saturn. While yes, there had compromises that needed to be made, but it is a testament to the dedication of the developers, and even with Sega themselves, to push through the boundaries and those limitations to get these games working on their platform. And in many ways it would have worked, because like I said, not everybody had access to all of these consoles. There would have been people desperately wanting to play Wipeout on the Saturn that probably might have played it on the PlayStation, maybe through a demo or temporarily, maybe even in a nightclub, because that was a thing back then, and they would have wanted to go home and play it in their own living room, like say if they had a Saturn there, but at least, right, they would have had to wait a while, but they would eventually get their hands on it. While it may not be as refined as that of the PlayStation, it's a marvel in what it was able to do, and despite its differences, Wipeout on the Saturn still remains an impressive achievement. And yes, it doesn't match the PlayStation's technical prowess, but for Sega fans, it still presents a nostalgic look to a time when cultures had changed, the world had changed, and video games were a direct reflection of how times were, and Wipeout just happened to fit right in. It made everything feel futuristic yet mature at the same time. Funnily enough, Wipeout on the Saturn is still seen as one of the greatest racing games on that platform, and it still stands as a testament to all of the creative challenges of multi-platform development of the 90s. Because when we look back, even during the development cycles of games for both platforms, even if you were a fan of even the games magazines that would cover a lot of these previews and articles, it was interesting to hear about the various stories of what was happening behind the scenes. And regardless of which side of the pond you were on, whether you were for the Sega Saturn or for the PlayStation, it was an exciting time for video games, without question. And Wipeout would be one of those games that would bring everything together, as it really did help define a generation. It really did. But whichever version you prefer, they're both worth trying. And always remember that for many of us, Wipeout on the Sega Saturn may have been among the first games we ever played, and it will hold a lot of nostalgic nostalgic memories for those people, and quite rightly so, because it is an awesome game, and it is still worth playing even to this day. And all of these elements would result in seeing one of the greatest sequels possibly ever in racing games, or in video games in general, and it wouldn't take long to see that come true.